Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Science. In this episode, we'll be having a look at DNA and genetics. What is DNA? What does it do? And why is it important to study? Are just some of the few questions we'll be answering in this particular episode. Firstly, you may have wondered why people in families often look alike. You might have noticed that you look a little bit more like your father or a little bit more like your mother or something in between. Now, why is this the case? What is the actual science behind this? We'll be able to answer that question by the end of this topic. You may have wondered what is meant by genetic disease. Perhaps you or a family member or a friend may be suffering from a genetic disease, but you're not quite sure exactly what a genetic disease is or how does it come about? What is the science behind a genetic disease? You might have heard something about genetic engineering on the news, or perhaps genetically modified foods, genetically modified organisms, GMOs. What actually are those things, and why is it important to us? We'll be able to answer those questions as well. Now, why are we learning it in Year 10? There's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, genetics and DNA combined with evolution, which is a topic you'll study later in the year, it forms a really good foundation to go on to do further biological studies. In order to do further biological studies, you need to have a good understanding of DNA, genetics, and also evolution. And so we want to give you that foundation in Year 10. The second major reason, and the reason why this particular topic is so relevant to all of you, is because most of you are probably going to go on to start a family of your own in the future. Now, you'll have some important questions to ask yourselves and try to answer in the future with your partners. And that is, what characteristics, what traits, what potential genetic diseases will we pass on to our children? Now, some of us may be carrying a genetic disease within our DNA right now and not even aware of it. It may show itself later on in life. But these are questions that you'll need to ask later on when you start thinking about beginning a family of your own. So there's two main reasons why this topic is so relevant. Firstly, it helps with further biological studies. And secondly, it's very relevant to your everyday life, especially when you go on to start a family of your own. So what actually is DNA? What does it stand for, to start with? DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Now, the DNA strand, you can sort of compare it to a computer code. The DNA strand is a biological code. It's the code that determines who you are, why you are the way you are. Just like a computer's code gives a computer instructions of what to do, you have a genetic code, a biological code that tells you what to do. Now, your genetic code can also be influenced by the environment, but there are also large parts of your genetic code that you're born with. You can't really do anything to change it. So what is this code actually made out of? What is the physical structure of this code? Well, let's start with breaking it down into subunits. The first subunit I'd like to break it down to is called a nucleotide. Nucleotide. And a nucleotide has three components to it. The first is a phosphate group here. And a phosphate group has one phosphorus atom and four oxygen atoms bonded together. Now, this phosphate group is bonded to a deoxyribose sugar, and that sugar is bonded to what's called a base. And I'll get to what the bases are in the next slide. In a test or exam situation, you'll often be asked to draw a nucleotide. It's a basic subunit of the DNA strand. And I would recommend drawing something that looks fairly similar to this. You've got a phosphate compound here that's bonded to a 5-sided deoxyribose sugar, and that's bonded to a base. And on the right hand side here, I've got your notes that you can go back and take. Sugar called deoxyribose, a phosphate which is represented by PO4, 1 phosphorus, 4 oxygen atoms bonded together, and a base. So what are these bases? Well, there are 4 of them. The first is adenine or adenine. We've got thymine, cytosine, and guanine. These are often represented by a single letter. Adenine will be shown with A, thymine will be shown with T, cytosine will be shown with C, and guanine will be shown with G. And they can even be given shapes just to help you match them together. Now these bases, depending on which order they are in, determines your genetic code. Now that order, that genetic code, determines who you are and why you are the way you are. My genetic code, so the sequence of my bases, is different to yours, and yours is different to everyone else's. Unless you are an identical twin or triplet, no one on planet Earth has the same DNA sequence as you. No one has the same code as you. But how do these bases link together? How do those nucleotides link together to form a chain? Let's have a look. So here, I'm beginning to join multiple nucleotides together. I'm starting to build my DNA strand. On the left-hand side here, I've got my phosphate, and that phosphate is joined to the deoxyribose sugar, and that's joined to the phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar. So you can see that you have an alternating structure here that forms the backbone, the sides of the ladder, you can imagine it to be. And in the middle, the rungs of the ladder, what you step on, are your bases. And when you join them together in this fashion, you begin to create one side of the DNA strand. But a DNA strand actually has 2 sides to it. So how do those sides link together? It's to do with the base pairing rule. So adenine will always form a bond with thymine. And those shapes now are becoming relevant to us. This thymine can now match with adenine, and cytosine bonds with guanine. And these shapes can now match up together as well. When you're doing your notes or in a test or exam situation, it can be helpful to assign these little shapes just to help you connect them together. But how does this make sense in the broader picture? How do we still go from one strand of DNA to a double strand of DNA? How do they link together? Let's have a look. Here is one side of my DNA strand with alternating phosphate, sugar, so on and so forth. And coming off the sugar into the middle are your bases. I can now, using my complementary base pairing rule, join the bases together. I've now formed a double helix. Now, when you join these bases together, to make your double helix, you have made your DNA strand. And depending on the sequence of your bases, which determines your genetic code, that will determine who you are and why you are the way you are. So my genetic code is different to yours. But the biological materials that my body uses is the same as yours and every other human and every other living thing on planet Earth. All living things that have DNA have the same biological material. They all have the same phosphate, they all have the same sugar, and they have the same 4 bases to work with. But we get all the variety of life purely from the sequence of these bases, the genetic code. If you change the code, you change the person. If you change the code a little bit more, well, you may change the organism into a whole different species. But we all share the same biological material. It's the code that makes us unique. Now, you've got a lot of this genetic material inside of your cells. Here, I've got a visual representation of the double helix. This double helix is actually coiled very tightly inside of your cells. This DNA actually lives in the nucleus of your cell. If I come to this slide here, within the nucleus of your cell, you'll find all of your genetic material. And this applies to all of the cells in your body. There are a couple of exceptions, such as red blood cells, but for the vast majority of your cells within your body, in each and every single one of them, within the nucleus of that cell, you'll find all the DNA material that you need to survive, all the DNA material that that cell needs to function. Depending on what that cell is, will determine which parts of the genetic code are activated or not activated. This is quite an involved process that you'll probably learn about in senior biology if you go on to study that. But for now, what we need to understand is that within the nucleus, you'll find all of the genetic material that we need to survive within the nucleus of all the cells in our body. So how much genetic material is actually in a nucleus, a single cell in a single nucleus? Well, if you were to stretch out all the DNA within a single nucleus, if you were to stretch it out, put it end to end, it'll be about 2 meters long. That is massive. How does your body fit 2 meters of genetic material, 2 meters of DNA strand, into something as microscopic as not only the cell, but the smaller nucleus that's within the cell? Well, it's got a trick up its sleeve. This double helix DNA strand begins to coil itself. Coil, 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 and it compresses itself as it coils. And then those coils form coils. They form coils around what's called these histone proteins. That helps them keep the DNA coils neat, orderly, and structured so they don't get tangled up. And then those coils coil amongst themselves. And then those coils coil amongst themselves until you've coiled and compressed your DNA material so much where you can go from a 2 meter DNA strand, and they are segmented into different pieces called chromosomes, but I'll get to that in a future episode. Those segments of DNA have now been compressed into the microscopic nucleus. Now, if you want to learn more, towards the end of this PowerPoint, you'll find some cool YouTube videos that you can click on and watch. And here, I've incorporated a couple of electron microscope photographs of chromosomes. And what are chromosomes we'll get to in a future episode. For your private study, you should go on to have a look at your Jacaranda textbook, and you should collect the DNA Goodness booklet from me as well. Thank you for watching this episode of Science. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in class.